So, hello and welcome to a very special episode of A Sort of Young Person's Guide to Prog Rock. I am your host, Ian Prize, and today I am joined by the Guitar Meister himself, Ed Thomas.
Hello.
Hello, Ed. And we have two very, very special guests, the Feckless Momes, the hosts of Talk Told Me. We have got Nick McGill.
Hello, hello.
And Omen Thomas Sade.
Hey, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for being here. So, today I will be your Dante, and I'm getting triple Virgiled by these three gentlemen. And we are going down into the briny depths of Jethro Tull's Songs from the Woods.
I got triple Virgiled in college once. It took me a long time to recover.
He has not stopped talking about it since then. Always brings it up at parties, I can't tell you.
So, here we are. So, when last we left Jethro Tull on this podcast, they had just completed Thick as a Brick. So, they would try that trick again with Passion Play, yet another whole song done over one album. They would do War Child and Minstrel in the Gallery, and finally tackle the cyclical nature of popular music with the rock opera-ish Too Old to Rock and Roll, but Too Young to Die. But finally, burnt out on prog and touring, Ian Anderson would retire to the Buckinghamshire countryside, which for all of you at home is unbelievably English. He'd read a bunch of English fairy tales and refind his spark. Thus, he would start the so-called folk trilogy with this album, Songs from the Woods, continuing on with Heavy Horses and Stormwatch. So, I guess we were going to start with you guys today. Ed, give me a brief little history of your relationship with this album.
So, I first heard of Jethro Tull watching the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus and seeing that performance of Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson giving all his character on stage. It just, it just won me over. And I went out to record store and I found this.
Wow.
Nice.
Yep.
There we go. Yep.
For £4, which in American money is what, $3?
Ed's holding up a live cat right now.
It's meowing to Songs from the Wood.
Yeah, Songs from the Wood, or with Kitchen Pros, Gutter Rhymes and Divers, Song from the Woods, as its full title is.
Yep.
And that was the first Tull album I ever heard. So in my head, that was the Tull sound. Obviously, the Tull sound started off very different and became something different again. But to me, that is and always will be Tull. I really love it, and it tells a story, and I like albums that tell a story. I love it. That's all I can say.
So, Nick, tell me about your relationship with this album.
So, like Ed, this was one of my first Tulls. I was digging through my dad's vinyl when I was probably in middle school, and I found Aqualung, Thick as a Brick, and Songs from the Wood. I had just started working at the Renaissance Festival, so obviously the cover drew me to it. And I listened to it and was enchanted. I had literally never heard any music like this before. I'd never heard folk music before. So this was pretty mind-blowing. And it became a regular. Of the three, of Thick as a Brick, Aqualung, and Songs from the Wood, this was my favorite out of that and continues to be my favorite out of that. It's one of my top albums, for sure.
Yep. And Omen, how did you come to this album?
Similar story to Nick. I had gotten introduced to Tull by actually somebody I went to high school with, because I played the flute in high school. And
okay, nice.
But I didn't know anything about rock and roll or even pop music at that time. So she was like, you should really listen to this band. It's rock and roll, but the guy plays a flute. And I was like, what? So I think I heard Aqualung first, and then finding this album a couple years later. I actually remember buying the CD at Barnes & Noble at the mall. My mom and my stepdad drove me down, and I remember playing it in my mom's Subaru on the way back. And where there's a vibroslap sound at some point where it goes... Yeah. I remember my stepdad going, "Oh my God, did we hit something? Did we run over a stick?" And I was like, "No, dude, it's rock and roll." But yeah, this has always been, ever since the first listen, it's always been a favorite album of mine, and one that I always go back to. And it sits at the core of Tullness, kind of like you said, Ed, for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny you all talk about the molten core of Tullness, because obviously for me, Aqualung was the very, very first of the Jethro Tull albums. It's just like a classic rock album that you kind of just find.
Yeah.
But then I discovered this, Heavy Horses, and Thick as a Brick kind of contemporaneously. And obviously when you're listening to the stuff, 50 years later, it's just one blob.
Yeah.
And so as all three of you have said, this was the Tull I thought was just Tull. I hadn't really thought like, there's like an evolution. It was like, yeah, there's a band that puts on cod pieces and sings about the woods. Like that's who they are. Yeah. So, and then the real local background to this, I have just been hiking on Offa's Dyke, which again, for those at home, is the borderline between England and Wales. So I've been out in the woods and the barley patches, listening to this album, preparing mentally for this, drinking from tiny acorns. So I'm really very dehydrated. But yeah, no, I was like, it genuinely being out in the English countryside / Welsh countryside gave me like such a deeper appreciation for what he was capturing in this album. And we'll get to what he's capturing in but 1 second.
Yeah.
But we are going to start now with a few first thoughts on this album. So this part of the series is about the 1970s prog bands reaching their final form. And I would say that this is the most delightful version of that. And as we kind of alluded to at the top, Ian Anderson was feeling a little burnt out, went back to the English countryside and rediscovered his inner gnome, I guess. So this is all happening in kind of the first blossoming of punk. I don't know how far off we are from true mainline disco, but we're not that far off.
Yeah, it can't be.
We are in the era of ELO with massive produced albums, very, very clean studio recordings. But this is a roots record, in a sense. And I'm going to say it's pure-ish folk. So I guess we'll talk about that. So it's not really pure folk, and I don't think Ian wanted it to be folk. So talk to me about where this sits in the folk prog punk zone.
Yeah, that's a loaded question.
Well, when I think of folk of this era, I think of the band that Tull pulled a lot of personnel from later down the line, Fairport Convention.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
That is, to me, that is really quintessential folk, and it has such a drastically different sound compared to Tull. Tull, particularly songs from The Wood and Heavy Horses, feels not in a derogatory way, but it feels almost like a caricature of folk. It's what does folk sound like to a non-musician? Oh, it's this, as opposed to that really nitty-gritty Fairport Convention just knocking the socks off of folk music.
Yeah.
The longer that Nick and I have explored Tull, the further that we've gotten into the forest, as it were, the more convinced that I have become that prog rock is not necessarily a musical style, but rather a musical approach. Which is always seeking what's next, pushing forward, reinventing itself. And if you look at the trajectory of Tull over the 50s to 60 years that they've been around, you really start to see that, where as soon as Ian does something where you can hang your hat on it and say, yes, this is Jethro Tull, he immediately changes it. So I think that I would say that this is more prog than folk. I think that it is a prog album in a folk codpiece, as it were. And he's giving us enough to hang on to with the musicality, the mandolins, and the approach, and the storytelling, and the subjects. But I think at its heart, it is a prog album, in my mind, because, and we'll talk about the time signatures and the polyrhythms and all the different things. But it reminded me of a quote. So right now in our podcast, we're all the way on Roots to Branches, which was, Nick, what year?
95.
So almost 30 years later.
Yeah.
And it has a strong Eastern influence. And Ian said about that album, and I think it's relevant to this, I was trying to stay within the general terms of rather more Eastern scales, but at the same time, I am not an academic when it comes to observing the real detail of Indian or Arabic or Spanish or Central European or whatever. I feel about it the same way I feel about folk music. I don't really like folk music. I don't really like Arabic music. I don't really like classical music. I don't really like jazz. But there are little elements of the construction of all of those kinds of music that intrigue me. So I think that he is taking on the character of folk music and playing with it and returning to this incredibly English sensibility.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that.
So I wouldn't say that it sounds like anyone's gone out of their way to make a folk album. But I think what you do have is, Ian Anderson is putting that element of himself across. So much so, the codpiece, you could hang your hat on it.
Yes, you could.
But he's not getting in the way of, everyone else doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I
yeah.
love about Tull in general. Everyone's just kind of cleaving their own way, and they seem to complement each other. No one gets in each other's way. Well, maybe they do in the studio, I don't know. But what you're hearing all works together nicely. I think,
Yes.
go into detail about stuff to do with Martin Barr and his gear and the way he plays and stuff. But I find Ian often gets overlooked with his guitar playing.
Yes.
And I think when the two play off each other, when the bass plays off it, it's all done in such a synced up manner that whether they're trying to or not, this particular album, more of Ian comes through because he's exploring himself, he's exploring his new environment, like you're saying, he's there living on this farm for the first time.
Yeah.
He's reading about new things, which becomes fuel for the next 3 albums.
Yes, very much so.
And it's like the stuff he's reading about, I find quite interesting in the storytelling environment. Those ancient British traditions are all about, living with nature. He's in nature. He's got this way to appreciate it. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Under Milkwood, not for any namesake reason, but you've got this kind of passage of time. It's just the night. They come in and they visit these different people's dreams, and you get to see like a little story from these different individuals. This album feels like it's a place, but time is shifting. So you're hearing like the solstice, you're hearing the Beltane festival.
Yeah, you're hearing the passage of the year.
Yeah, you're hearing like some of the folk characters are to do with farming and when you plant your seed and stuff like that. So it's like a passage of time, and anytime someone can convey an entire album with like one type of story, I'm just hooked in. I love it. And I think this is such a good example of that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that I think the place that the band was at the time when they recorded this album was a time of real complicity with each other. This was a sweet spot. Martin was just coming into his own. John Evans was not so far out of the style like he, I think, became a little bit later, but he had fully integrated into the style. Barrymore Barlow's, of course, just tremendous.
So good.
Glasscock, I think, really is probably the best bassist of Tull ever, and there've been some really good bassists.
Yeah.
We're in the David Pegg era right now, who's just a genius, but John
Phenomenal.
Glasscock brings something really special.
Yeah.
And then Dee Palmer is somebody who listed on the album as David Palmer, later changed her name and now lives as Dee Palmer. Her influence on Tull is it cannot be overstated, and there's the complicity between the band at this point really comes through in the album.
Yeah.
When you're saying about the bass there, I feel like there's a point in the first song where the bass kicks in, and that's when you realise this isn't just a folk album anymore. This is like this is hard hitting.
Yeah.
And that's your in, isn't it? That's your hook that just draws the ear in. This is prog now.
John Glasscock would not allow for this to be a folk album. If he's on bass, it's going to be rockin'. It has to be.
No, and I think you all bring up a good point in that it is Ian Anderson's album, but it shines such a light on everyone else. I think they do bring it to the world of folk-ish. Mm-hmm. And I think you just feel that folk root, but no, it's a rocking, and quite proggy album. And we'll get to that when we get to the songs. But I guess to bring it back, the one other thing I do think is of the folk tradition, and why no matter what he protests, I will always say Tull was a little bit of a folk band.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The fact that everything tracks to the vocals. So this is where we'll get into like all the tempos and all the changing and whatnot. But one of you mentioned Fairport Convention, and they were part of the British folk revival of the late 60s. Mm-hmm. So real brief. That was a bunch of young English kids rediscovering the quote-unquote native folk of England, but adding that Californian kind of hippie rock late 60s soundscape. So there's a lot more like electric guitars and sitars and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But it has a lot of shifting tempos. It's not 4 on the floor, and I think that's very English folk. And Ian Anderson and crew will play with that shifting tempo, which is based off of the vocals, to great effect throughout this album. So as I'm sure we'll do a rundown, but there's going to be about 15 different tempos that we'll probably hit throughout all this. So any other thoughts about the folk-ishness before I hit the main themes of the album?
Just to note that, Ed, you mentioned this, but there was a specific book that Ian came across in the lead up to this album. I don't remember for the life of me the title. I tried to look it up and can't find it.
It is Folklore, Myths, and Legends of Britain.
Well, there you are.
It's right there in the title.
And he's spoken about drawing a lot of inspiration specifically from that. And as we know, it's all throughout this album. But I just wanted to mention that there we know that there is a specific inspiration, as well as the general inspiration of moving out to the country and reconnecting with nature and all that.
Yeah. And, those sort of folk traditions of ancient Britain are all about being out in nature. So it's like those two things are just, in harmony with one another.
Perfect coming together of those.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that leads us on to what I'm going to say the two main themes are of this album. So the very, very first one is the wild, wild woods. So obviously, as we mentioned, Ian Anderson is now living out in the kind of countryside. And I'm assuming he backs onto some nice wooded areas in Buckinghamshire. But this is an album for me that is very much about effing, effing, and effing. And for all of our 5-year-old listeners, that's feasting, festivals, and frolicking. No, actually, there's not much fighting going on in this album. But no, this is an album of the wild woods. And I will say, I use the word creepy, not derogatorily, but I'm sure for any of you who've been out in the woods late at night, it's a creepy place.
Yeah.
It's unsettling. Mm-hmm. And not that he gets into this, lion eats antelope circle of life, but I think that type of thing is in this album. Or at least I hear the unease that nature lives in.
And that connects again with the English tradition. I just saw the worst production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that I've ever seen in my life. But was reminded, it gave me an opportunity to think about the text. The whole conceit is that the lovers go into the woods and night falls, and suddenly they're not in the human world anymore. They are in the world of the fairies, and the fairies are in charge. And that gets restated at the end of the play. Oberon says, it is basically, it's now past midnight. It is now the fairy hour, so we are in charge. Their power waxes and wanes with the day. That is so deeply rooted in the English psyche, I think, that as soon as you step into the woods, you have that sense of, I'm not really the one in charge here. There's this other power.
Yeah. Yeah, it triggers the lizard brain a little bit.
No, and I think as you kind of bring up there, I'm sure because we've got a prog rock audience, they don't need to be told about fairy lore. But I think like the big deal there is like the traditional English fairy or forest creature, whatever, is almost never just a guardian fairy. It's always an ambivalent creature. It's tricksterish.
Yes. Yeah, mischievous.
It's mischievous. Its powers are unknowable.
Yes.
You don't know what's going to happen. Genuinely, I think backing onto the woods, that's part of this. And not to get too deep about this, I think this is when you start living with the land. Not that Ian Anderson was sustenance farming, but I think when you're living with the land, I think stuff like frosts and, horrible Dutch elm disease or whatever affects strawberries and whatnot.
Yeah.
I'm not good at farming.
Dutch elm I'm pretty sure it does not affect strawberries, but
Norse strawberry disease.
There you go.
Yeah, no, as in I think when you get this sort of stuff, I think you're at nature's whim, and I think that again is very unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, like all of these sort of characters from the folklore, it's like it's older than you think. It's older than England. It's they talk about the winter solstice becomes an element in this album.
Yes,
and the idea of Christmas and stuff like that is pre-Roman.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of these sort of characters probably are from
older than the hills.
Yeah,
certainly. Yeah. Yep.
So just baked in to these folk tales, and talking about Shakespeare, a lot of that stuff goes back to the old British bards. That's why they refer to him as the bard.
Yeah.
And you do feel it, like you say. Nick and I were really lucky we just took a trip recently, well, earlier this year, to the UK. In April, we went to the UK, saw a Tull concert, and then went up to Scotland. And man, when you're out in the hills in Scotland and there's nobody around, it's we went to the Isle of Skye, and it's like, this is a different world. This is not, I am an insignificant speck, and this landscape has a personality and a will of its own.
Yeah. It's transcendent.
Yeah.
Speaking of fairies, the tradition of knocking on wood was to, if you're saying something that you don't want to happen, you knock on wood so the fairies don't hear you saying it. Because if they hear you say it, they'll make it happen.
That's when you listen to our podcast. That's that knocking sound that you hear in the background all the time.
Every time.
Very, very conscious on
Yes,
the Feckless
yeah,
Moans audio network.
You've not been changed into a hideous old man fairy, so, something's working.
You didn't see me 5 years ago.
Not on the outside, but on the inside.
So that's kind of, I'd say, the more extra personal element to this album. But I'd say the real theme I get from this album, just dripping through, is the springtime of Ian. So he's out in the woods. He said something to the effect of, like, I felt like I was a child at play again, which is what you hear. I feel, and we'll get to this in comparison to the stuff that came before, but I feel like this is the least self-conscious of their works in a long time.
Yeah.
And to Ed's point a little while ago, I guess, about the springtime, I don't think of this as a hard and fast concept, but I can hear the arc of the year. The beginning feels very much like spring, and the end feels very much like winter. And of course, you're all going to say, well, Ring Out Solstice Bells is right in the middle. And to that I say, screw you. It's a summer song. For me, I hear a pretty clear arc of time. And again, a personal joy.
And even if you didn't say, even if you can't put the album on the calendar and say, well, this perfectly lines up here, each track, each song by itself has a distinct seasonality to it.
Yes.
So the seasonality is a subtext or almost another character in a lot of the songs.
Yeah. Any other general thoughts?
Just the fact that Ian is about 30. He's about 29 in this era. If that makes any difference, if that's something to keep in mind chronologically, he's about 30.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, I guess, because what I got from Too Old to Die... Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die, which is the album right preceding this. I think you can hear him starting to think about his, I think he denied this, but even if you can hear him start to think about his legacy, in a sense, in the rock world, as I think that starts to get heavy. And, I guess people were older back in the 70s, but, I think he was genuinely probably feeling his middle age at age 29 or whatever.
Yeah. For a teetotaling rock star, it probably wore on him.
Yeah.
Although they toured all the time. So even without that, I'm sure he was pretty beaten down.
Yeah, and I think you have to think about, if you're a rock star, I think you're probably always thinking about what's the next show, what's the next critic going to say of their album. And as we know from Thick as a Brick, they did listen. I think you're out in the world, and that's a lot of eyeballs, a lot of stress.
Yeah.
I think as well, when you look at some of the early performances, the amount of energy that he's putting into the performance that isn't required necessarily, but that's now part of the character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, you've got to think, how long can I keep this up?
The wear on your patellas is insane.
Well, the whole one leg thing,
Yeah.
We take that out of it. Just his stage character is always a bit kind of bubbly and a bit spiky, isn't it? And that's additional energy you don't really require to put on the show. But
I was going to say, I think this is completely his fault, but he is also the spotlight. He's the one. He's the front man. He's the creative force. He's the producer. The band's fortunes rest very firmly on his shoulders. So I bet he was tired.
Yeah, a lot of factors leading into that rapid aging.
So, without further ado, we will go on to the first track of this album, Songs from the Woods. So, this song for me is two things. So, a thematic calling card, and we'll get to that in a second. But firstly, it is a call to the show. So, you kind of briefly just mentioned it there, Ed. So, much like Thick as a Brick, where he's telling you, I'm about to tell you this story. I'm thinking of Sgt. Pepper's. I'm thinking of Come All Ye from Fairport Convention.
Yes.
This is an ancient custom going back
Yes, it
to,
is.
I'm assuming, ancient Greece, probably in every theater tradition almost, saying, come, pull up a chair and listen to the show, prepare to be entertained.
So our name, the Feckless Momes, we took on that name when we were doing shows that were very, very inspired by the English mumming tradition. And as you'll obviously be familiar, that is a very, very old seated tradition in England, performance. And one of the things that we saw over and over again when we were researching it was that the first thing that you do is a lot of the plays start with this call. And in some of them, if you look at the wassailing plays, where you go from house to house and do a performance at each house, the first lines are, clear the tables, move the chairs away from the center of the room, give us space to play, give us space to play. And that is so much what he is doing in this song. He is saying, give me the space to express this to you. It's in your interest to do so.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that actually happening? You're just having your dinner.
Say again?
just clear the room. Outrageous.
Well, that's how I want this podcast to be, is I want us to impose upon people's rest. So if you're at the gym, clear away your mugs of mead and listen to these bards three. But I think in a practical sense, you're clearing the table. But I think in an emotional sense, let's get deep here. In an emotional sense, you're clearing your mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Getting ready to accept the tale that's about to be told to you. Now, there isn't really a story that this album's going to, tell you. But it's a bunch of stories, and you'll be in a place to hear them. And this is true for everything. And I think, probably the most famous thing is beginning of Romeo and Juliet. Like, that's probably the most famous version of this, where he says,
two houses alike in dignity in fair Verona, where we play our scene. Yeah.
Yep.
I also think that there is an element of setting up his own position. Not just I'm going to tell you this story, but before you listen to this album, I'm going to teach you how to listen to this album. And it starts even before you put it on. Jethro Tull with kitchen prose, gutter rhymes, and diverse songs from the wood. So this isn't saying, this is an elevated artistic expression. Listen to this is an operatic take on. No, he's saying kitchen prose. This is everyday stuff. Gutter rhymes. We might get a little bit dirty, and songs from the woods. He's saying this is for everyone, and he supports that point in the Songs from the Wood. I'll toast you all in penny cheer. That this is your birthright. This is something that is accessible to you. It doesn't cost anything to get this love of nature. It'll revive you. And I do think that we were talking about the 70s, the Back to the Land movement and all this, that fits all within this. And even the way that he lays out that first track, you pointed it out, Ed, that it starts with this polyphonic, multi-Ian voices track. And then at a certain point, the bass and the drums drop in. Yeah. That is a way of teaching you the song. Yes, we're taking this folk stuff, but it's still rock and roll. And so now that you know how to listen to it, you can go on to the rest of the album.
Yeah.
And we'll get to the music in a second. But yes, I completely agree with you that it's a calling card for both the themes that you're going to kind of explore and the soundscapes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd say the other really obvious theme for me here is, it's the most obvious theme. It's a callback to nature. And I think time and time again in the song, he's saying, let nature into your heart and it will heal you. And I was like, I think that sets you up thematically for what you're going to do for the rest of the album, is just be in nature. Yeah. Different aspects of it, but be in nature.
Yeah, nature is not just the color green, it covers all of these different aspects. We get mist, we get green coming up through the concrete, we get a stream, we get stars, we get all sorts of it. It's all covered there in different views. And I mean, even just looking at the cover, before you even put the album on, you get an idea. You see the woods, you see this chopped down, you see Ian in his leathers and his hunting rifle. Yeah. It's everything. Everything is built around this idea. It's kind of this nucleus is Ian delivering it, but there's so much more floating around that we encounter along the way.
Yeah. So, talking now about the song musically, so I think we can all agree that this is Ian Anderson blossoming into what I guess we'd all agree is Ren Fair goodness.
Yeah, definitely.
And again, I think actually the analogy goes deeper than I even thought about right there. In so much as Renaissance fairs don't even capture actual medieval times, they capture the bits of the medieval times we want to capture.
Right.
Now that I think about it, and I was like, I actually think that that's what this song does. He's using old with an E English words and a jaunting kind of non-4/4 skippity-doo-dah beat. Mm-hmm. But as we talked about at the beginning, it's not pure English folk.
Right.
I think he's calling back to what we all think English folk is, and now this is, this is Jethro Tull.
Yeah, I think with Ian's play, like his guitar playing, for example, he talks about how he's influenced by people like Bert Yanks and people who are like very, very folk. Bert Yanks with like Pentangle. You can hear that on some of the other previous albums, but in this you can hear he's kind of more simplified in his playing approach, but you can still hear the little flavours that he enjoys of that. Mm-hmm. I think he's very good at being inspired by things without aping them.
Yes.
I think that sums up him as a person. He's got the ability to learn this stuff, but he comes through.
That's really well said, Ed. And that carries through the entire trajectory of Tull, even with the current stuff that they've put out this year.
Right.
Yeah.
That's just a great way to say it.
Yeah. No, and I was going to say, I guess to that point when, he's saying he's starting with ye olde folk, we then come mid-phrase, which, by the way, is unbelievably hard to do for those at home. Mid-phrase, the band drops in, and we have the full band kick in. So, yeah, I guess talk to me about the band, because the history behind this, apparently this was more of a cohesive group effort. And I'm not sure if I hear that one way or the other, but what do you guys hear in terms of the interaction between Ian and the band?
It's always so difficult to know, given that no dirty laundry really ever comes out about the band. Mm-hmm. Given that Ian is clearly the front man, has come out and said he is Jethro Tull.
Yeah.
And given these different eras of having the people that he was with for 10 years, then he swaps out people and all that, it's hard to know just what level of participation everybody has. That being said, I think these earlier eras, definitely, it feels more cohesive. It's not Ian popping his head in and saying, okay, you play this, then you play this, then you play this. Yep. This feels more of a group effort here. And it feels more ensemble. Not to say that Rock Flute didn't rock with everybody really contributing some awesome work there, but you can kind of feel, and this, I think I said this on when we talked about when we saw the concert in London, everybody on stage, they could have been insurance adjusters. They were doing their job. And they were rocking the hell out of those insurance adjustments, but they were doing their job. Back this era, they were rocking for the sake of rocking, and they were creating that music to create that music, it feels like.
Yeah.
I feel like there's also like, an element of the studio that comes across. When musicians are younger and they're in these serious studios, there's also the guys who work in these studios. They're serious engineers who take their stuff seriously, and they're not ordered about by these kids. So, you know what I mean? As they get older, more experience, you're probably starting to push the boundaries.
Keep the professionals away.
But like you said, Ian's 30 here. Now he may be starting to become the adult in the room.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah, he's very hands-on, certainly later on, and it wouldn't surprise me if he started to really dabble right around now.
Or even earlier.
Even earlier, for Christ's sake, yeah.
I also think in terms of what we hear, Ian is credited as being the arranger for everything, and I'm sure that's true. But Dee Palmer's influence, I believe this was her first time joining the band?
Yes, as a full member.
As a full member. Yeah. Thank you, Ian. Yeah. Her influence on the style of music is subtle, but very present. It is, if you listen to the stuff before she joined and after she left, it really has a different flavor, and I think that she brings a cohesiveness to everything that she touches. I mean, it's really she's an extraordinary composer and synth player.
So was she involved in the orchestration, and then they've brought her in because they like what she's done, basically?
Yes, as a full synthist / keyboardist.
Exactly.
That's cool. Yeah, so I imagine that brings in a new joyful dynamic to have a new guy on board.
And a perspective of arrangement rather than, John Evans is a fantastic piano player, but I wouldn't call him an arranger or he's not composing. He's chasing squirrels in his own brain and, only half there. He's great. I love his playing. But Dee brings a perspective to the album that really helps the structure of it.
And I was going to say, I guess to thread all of those needles that we've just brought up, I think irregardless of if it was Ian doing this or the band doing that or whatever, I think it does feel like everyone has something to do all the time. And that's a nice feeling. I do feel like if you listen to the web that everyone's building behind these beautiful songs, and as you say, I think Dee Palmer is an integral part to this, I think they are orchestrated.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can hear counter melodies, you can hear all sorts of beautiful, interesting harmonies that are being brought out and whatever, rhythms, all this sort of stuff. There's so much going on, and it doesn't clog anything up, and that's the orchestration, I think.
Yeah.
That's orchestration is doing a lot and not sounding like you're doing too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And using the right instruments to do the right jobs.
Yes.
So, for example, where you are hearing piano on this is a beautiful Steinway they've got in the studio. We were talking about how certain characters have got their own musical vibe that comes across. It might not necessarily be that they're all folk players, but in this, the drums, they're bringing in some medieval era drum instruments.
The knackers and the tabor.
Is that where it's got the knackers?
Yeah. Knackers and tabor.
I don't know if Americans are aware of this, but the knackers is British for the old testiculae.
Which is Latin for balls.
Now we know why the sporran was so warm later on.
But yeah, all those sort of slack, flappy kind of drums that you're hearing are this kind of medieval sounding. What did you get? What's the other one? The tabor. Did you call
it? That's a hand drum. It's a circular hand drum, and the word literally just means drum, but it's a very basic, like you mentioned, slightly slack. I think it's similar to the bowrun. Bowrun.
Oh, the Irish.
The Irish drum, yes.
Yeah.
But it's old. It's a very old instrument.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the first time you hear the drums take on that oldie-wildy vibe that I feel I've heard. I may be wrong.
I think we've had instances where we've had experimentation within the percussion, but we often talk about, is this a drums song or is this a percussion song?
Right.
And nice, yeah.
And this is definitely, we're getting into the era of percussion, not just drums.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, the elephant in the room, the scandal behind the curtain here is, of course, they did Minstrel in the Gallery 2 years before this, but this crystallized a medievalness, again, a Ren Fair medievalness. They crystallize it so much clearer in a musical kind of language for this album.
One of the things that we've had the opportunity to see approaching Tull in the absolutely maddening, inadvisable way that we have been for the past, Nick, how long have we been doing this? 600 years?
500. 5 years. We started January 1st, 2019 was our first episode.
It's the same thing that you see if you really get encyclopedic with any artist, Charlie Chaplin, Shakespeare. You start to see, okay, here is the big expression of this. Here's Romeo and Juliet, for instance. Yep. But if you go back to Two Gentlemen of Verona, you find a version of Romeo's banishment speech that is just a less good version of the speech in a slightly different context, and you see Shakespeare kind of working it out. You see Chaplin doing the same thing. I think that there's so many examples that we have come across of Ian doing that where we're like, oh, wait a minute, this really reminds us of this, but it's not quite the fully developed idea. And I do think that there's something to Minstrel, especially that first track, obviously, where he's opened up a door into a world, and I think in this album he's gone fully into that world and dragged us along with it, invited us. along.
Invited us pleasantly
Consensually dragged us kicking and screaming
into his woods.
into his woods.
So the one final thought I have about the song, only because it's a personal love I didn't know I had. When a lyric says, I am I love it. And I was looking back in my own, and we'll get to what I actually mean by that in a second. I was looking back into my own psychology as to where this came from, and I think this is Halloween from Nightmare Before Christmas, where it says, I am the wind blowing through your hair, I am the voice underneath your bed, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And in this song, less creepily, he says, I am the frost, I'm the wind to fill your sails, all that sort of stuff. And the artist personifying a thing, whatever that might be, I was like, God, that's such a fun lyrical trick. And he does that a little bit, not quite, not in the same grammatical tense, with Jack in the Green.
Ian, that's great that you have pulled that out of here, because that also dates back to the very oldest of storytelling traditions. I think what I get from his saying, I am the wind, I am the cross to take your nail, etc., is that he is imbuing himself with that power. If you go back to the Iliad or the Odyssey or Ovid, often the poets will start with an invocation saying, "O muses, give me the strength and creativity to do this crazy thing that I'm about to do. Give me whatever," and they invoke a certain muse or a god. In a way, I think that's what Ian is doing. He is saying, let me become a vessel for this power of nature that's in here. I am the wind, I am this thing, and now that I'm charged up, we can get into the album.
Yeah.
Yeah, always invoke the muse before you get into anything creative.
Yeah, obviously.
So, we are now in the Jack in the Green. So, Jack in the Green, of interest, and we'll get into what makes that interesting, is an Ian Anderson solo song. So apparently he was filled to the brim with inspiration to come in on one beautiful Sunday and just record the song. So I guess we'll start at the very top. Jack in the Green. Who is this little guy? What's the story?
Well, as Ed, you mentioned, these folk characters go back really, really far. And they get a little blurry. Again, just having seen this absolutely wretched, insulting production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, I was reminded of the wonderful line, "Are you not that rude and knavish sprite called Robin Goodfellow? Or are you not he who makes the crabapple do this and steals the butter from the churn and frights the horses?" And then Robin Goodfellow goes on to say, "Yes, and not only that, but I also do this, and I frighten these old ladies, and I steal this guy's shoes, and I do all this stuff." This is one of those characters. Whether we say, this is Robin Goodfellow, or this is the Green Man, it almost is arbitrary. This is, Jack in the Green is this manifestation of that natural power, that kind of Green Man protector energy. And I think it's, like you rightly pointed out, Ed, this is Ian saying, here's the tradition, and now I'm giving you my take on it. And just so you know it's my take, I'm going to play every motherfucking instrument on the song. Which, this was the first song that I ever heard knowingly where it was all one artist, and it blew my mind. I literally was like, I did not know that was something that a person could do. Like, I didn't know that there wasn't a rule against that. Like, how can he be doing that?
And it does make a point of saying so on the back of the album as well.
Yes, so he wouldn't let that slip past us without mentioning it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that character as well there's a link with that time of the year thing again.
Yes.
He's talking about the little acorn cup and stuff. Now it's linked with like druidic
the seedlings.
Stuff.
Yeah.
But also it's like the frosts are melting, the spring is coming up. Jack in the Green could also be the little bits of green that you first see in springtime.
Yes.
As well.
Oh, absolutely.
There's lots of ways you can interpret what's going on, but it definitely it's a rebirth of life.
Well, this is what I was saying about the springtime of the album. Is I feel like we're starting with this, the frost is melting away and the whatever's coming out.
It's positioning this song against the direction that the world is moving. We were talking about disco. I mean, my God, how much more urban of an art form could you get than disco? It is by its nature an art form which exists in groups of people in the concrete. And Ian is saying, yes, all of that world exists. But don't forget that this other world still exists. I saw some grass growing through the concrete today. That is my favorite line ever. It's worth also noting that we are recording this on Ian's birthday, on Ian Anderson's birthday.
77, I think.
Oh,
yes.
Happy birthday, Ian Anderson.
Yeah. Wow.
We just got a note on our Discord chat. One of our Patreon members commented, "Happy birthday to the blunderbuss of Blackpool, the scion of Skye, the flaneur of flautists, the irreplaceable MBE Scott, Sir Ian Scott Anderson." Not sure if he's actually knighted.
Beautiful.
He should be.
He should be.
I'll put in a note with King Charles.
I'll talk to Sealand
Yeah. I'm sure they'll do it. They're
for a
desperate.
price.
Yeah, I was going to say, so obviously there's the environmental themes. He says, will these power lines keep us apart? No, I don't think so. He's getting into that kind of thing. But yeah, again, to kind of keep up with the dark woods element, I think this is the point in his career where you can really hear his voice hardening. So I think what was very weird for me, because obviously all of this, as I said at the very top, those kind of 4 albums existed contemporaneously for me. And by Heavy Horses, he's got a real gruffness to him. And it was then weird, with quote-unquote professional ears, going back to, Thick as a Brick, and then thence to Aqualung, and then even farther back to, like, Benefit and stuff. And he's got actually a very sweet voice. But it really starts to harden by this. And I don't say that in a derogatory way. I think it just adds, again, this element of, this isn't going to be twee folk. This is going to be dark woods.
Yeah, it's gruff.
He's got many voices, isn't he?
Yes,
I
he
remember
has.
Yeah, I guess that's a thing too.
Aqualung, he's almost playing characters with his voice, with different songs.
Well said.
Yeah.
But here it's like he's kind of settling on something.
Yes. I think he's finding a new version of himself. As like you've said, Ian, this is a springtime for Ian. He is reblooming. And every time he blooms, it's a different kind of flower.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. Yeah, and I was gonna say, I think I think you can hear that because this is just him. He is having a lot of fun with this song.
Yes.
And I was gonna say, I guess the one other thing I really love about this musically, the vocal line, or I guess the whole melodic line, totters on the edge of a diving board almost, and then tumbles down. And I love, again, this comes back to that folk tradition of everything is supporting the vocal line. And he's going, ba, 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 da, 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 da. But every time, I don't know how long that da, 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 where he's like coming to the edge of the diving board and then goes, Jagger in the green. And I think there is something about that it's such a hook where you're like, okay, when's he going to say Jack in the Green? And you don't know when the Jack in the Box is going to go off in a sense.
Wow, yeah. There's also there's a dynamic element to that too. He plays a little bit more with that sweeter side of his voice for a lot of the verses. Be 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 dee, da 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 da, and he brings up he brings some intensity to that. It's almost a sforzando. That I love what you're saying. You never know when it's going to pop up, and that's thematic of the song as well. You never know in the middle of London where you might see a bluebell blooming suddenly.
Yep.
Yeah, that kind of dynamic range is kind of. You don't really hear it in modern music quite the same way, do you?
Not as much.
Yeah, as you say, I guess that's a massive range of, and almost like an emotional range as well.
Yes.
Where it like literally skips along
Yeah.
and rocks out within the space of like 15 seconds.
Yeah, a modern producer would be really scared about this stuff. They like to have everything all like in a neat little box, all this volume all the way through. But, there's so much joy in playing with like the volume and the energy that gives the song and where it's taking you on the journey.
Yeah.
You just don't have today. I love it.
Yeah.
A modern example that comes to mind is Omen's all-time favorite right now is Chapel Roan.
Oh my God.
Very dynamic.
Yeah.
Very, very dynamic in her stuff.
Nick, I am so proud of you for bringing up Chapel Roan before I did.
Have to check it
Gentlemen, if you don't know Chapel Roan, go and listen to her album. It really is.
It's phenomenal. It's real good.
Phenomenal.
It has a lot of references musically to the 80s. It's really unique. She just broke records at Lollapalooza in Chicago for having the biggest crowd ever. But you're totally right. She plays a lot with that dynamic range. Yeah.
Nice.
And I guess, again, different emotional flavors.
Yeah.
Maybe within 15 seconds.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of nuance.
Any other thoughts about Jack and the Green?
This to me feels like Dr. Ian Malcolm saying life finds a way.
Ah,
So we roll on to the Cup of Wonder. So I don't know if this is some sort of obvious legend that I've missed. Do you guys know if this is an obvious legend? Because I've got many theories about the theme of this song, but I was like, is the Cup of Wonder a thing?
I think it's just people sharing the bounty of the harvest, isn't it? It's just breaking bread with friends, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I would say it is and it isn't. There are lots and lots and lots of legends about magical cups. One of them in Britain specifically, it takes the form of a cauldron.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of, actually, I think the Green Man Festival the original Green Man Festival had something related to that. But the image of the life-giving cauldron, or like you were talking about, Ed, a lot of the Christian symbols predate Christianity. The Holy Grail is a symbol, pretty much, I would say, this symbol. The act of imbuing a drinking vessel with, or Odin's drinking horn,
Tankard or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
There's a Welsh story in a book called the Mabinogion about putting soldiers into the big cauldron and
Yes.
they just come back to life. But
Yes.
like
Yes,
kinda
that's
like
it.
Oh,
zombies.
wow.
But yeah.
So there are a lot of versions of this, and I think that this is just Ian's take on it. He's taking that primordial, that almost pre-mythic image and suiting it to his own uses and combining it with his own imagery and seasons of the year and everything.
I like that.
And I was going to say, I'll be gosh darned if that isn't a good metaphor for what he's been doing. All of this stuff is that it's not actually a specific medieval whatever, but it feels like it should be.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I think that's the thing, is like the whole time I was like, yeah, I know what he's talking about, the Cup of Wonder. Like everyone knows the Cup of Wonder. And I was like, yeah, but then I couldn't think of what it actually was.
Yeah.
And, again, I think that the themes of merriment, I think there's a harvest festival in there.
Yes.
We're talking corn kings.
Yes.
We're talking the first blush of wine, all this stuff. You can hear the ribaldry.
I think he takes these themes and these grander ideas and makes them more approachable and more human. It's not the Holy Grail. It's the cup that we share. It's the cup that this group of real humans in the present moment can share together. It's the exact same thing. It's just not this mythic chalice. It's this cup of wine that I'm sharing with you.
Yeah.
It's also important to remember that Cup of Wonder is very much a Mayday / Beltane song. Beltane being, of course, the spring equinox. And I think I have that right. It might be one of those.
Yeah, it happens around May. Yeah.
And Beltane is all about, after the long winter, the juices are flowing again. And I think in some Beltane traditions, my brother is a druid. I haven't asked him recently, but he practiced druidism for a long time. And I believe that there is actually a tradition of passing the cup at the maypole. After you dance the maypole, everybody drinks from the same cup. And that gives you a chance to, check out who you might want to get lost in the woods with.
Get COVID.
Which is
Get
another
COVID.
song in a bit. Yeah, but I guess to that point, I think, for me, that was the most obvious theme of this song, is this is Ian being back in love with life.
Yes.
And he kind of, dare I say, the one song I couldn't get out of my head during all of this was the 1995 classic Colors of the Wind.
Wow.
Let me show you the wonders of the world. But legitimately, I think that's kind of what
Wow.
Cup of Wonder was for me, was like, let me show you how magical the world is out there. Drink a draft from this mighty cup and blah, 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 blah. And, I think that's what it is I'm back in love with all of this stuff, this life.
Similarly, this really reminds me of that classic track from around 2012, Lil Jon's Shots.
Yep, his little Cup of Wonder.
Many little cups of wonder.
His little acorn shots.
There's also this theme, and I mean, it's just a variation on a theme of abundance. Springtime coming back into a world of abundance. Pass the word and pass the lady. Pass the plate to all that hunger. Pass the wit of ancient wisdom. Pass the cup of crimson wonder. So there's this sense of what the cup is not just, it is perhaps also literally a cup of wine, but it is the abundance of the world that we live in, and not just the modern world, but everything that came before us. And the knowledge of that. Here, I'm going to pass to you this ability to reconnect with this ancient world around us and drink from that.
And I guess I think that's coming back to the role he set up for himself as the kind of the bard. He's traveled to this tavern, and he's going to tell you about shots and stuff. He's going to tell you about these magical things. I guess 2 other points on this, and this is now more musically. I was trying to think about what it is about this that is more successful for me than the albums that came before it. Like, there's something about this album, and I think it's the lightness. And I think this song could have been shitty. I think it's one of those songs, like, he's just like, it's kind of really, it's too upbeat for him. It's too simple for him. I don't know. There's something about that. And yet this whole album, and it just walks that tightrope, and it never falls off. It walks the tightrope the whole time, but it's the lightness for me. Whereas I think, personally, he tripped over his words a few times in the preceding albums, where I think there's a density that I, as a prog fan, enjoy.
Yeah.
I think mainly here of, like, Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die, where that was a kind of pseudo-musical. And I think the density and the him mugging for the camera, like, you know how witty I'm being. You're loving it.
Yeah.
And I think that can kind of clog up the works a little bit. I think this is just shaves everything away, and somehow he's keeping it simple, keeping it festive.
Yeah.
There's an authenticity to his work on this album that really helps it stay away from the twee side of things, as you said. It's all about how he delivers it. If, like you said, if you made this same song with someone who thought that this is what they were supposed to be doing, it would be awful. But because you get the sense, you're like, by the end of the song, you're like, yeah, I will pass the cup of wonder. Yes.
Like, I know exactly what you're saying. Yep. And I think the other bit to this, again, that keeps it from being too simple, and this is something Tull are absolutely excellent for, so they do a good multi-part riff. And I feel like there's a musical term for this, but I can't think of what it is, where the melody is shared between, like, 8 instruments. And, you know, it's kind of what we're talking about with D. Palmer and the orchestration. Tull does a great job of, like, there's a flute, and then it kicks off to a mandolin, which kicks off to a, you know, the drum beat or whatever. You know, I think that they're always just passing the torch. Yeah. And I think that means that you're never like, okay. And, you know, Aqualung performs this trick beautifully where it's just, you know, it's a riff, and it's a riff we understand. But this kind of music, they're all passing a melody around like a little hot potato.
And that approach has a lot of roots in the folk traditions. If you look at bluegrass, or if you go to a Irish music jam at a bar or whatever, typically you'll have the melody, you'll have the verse, the singer sings it, and then there'll be a breakdown. And if there are 12 people in the circle, the tradition is that everybody plays the verse once. Okay, now you pass it off to the next person, they put their little variation on it. Pass it off to the next person, well, they just started playing the guitar, so they're only going to play 2 notes, but they're going to do their version of that song. And so that even the structure of the song has relevance to the folk tradition.
Yeah, I like that.
But at the same time, they are adding in these little details, like there's that choral, I think it's the synthesizer, but it goes ba 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 ba.
Yes.
Where the beat stops. It's like bum ba da 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 da, and he finishes it ba 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 ba, and that's sort of out of rhythm or out of the meter. So it gives your ear that sense of, wait a minute, I have to be careful in listening, and then it drops back into the main part of the song.
Comes back in. Yep.
Yeah, I think there's 2 musical things of note in this, I found. One is the staple, and that's, you know, Ian Anderson and Martin Barr sharing the lead line.
Yes.
Flute and lead guitar. And I think the only reason it really works so well is because of the actual equipment that Barr's using. So I think this is a real good example of, you know, when a guitarist, they say it's all in the fingers. Now he's kind of changed his rig at this point. So before this he's using like a 200 watt high watt, which is a hefty beast, and he's throwing a treble booster into it. So this is the same as what Tommy Iommi uses in Sabbath. And for this album he's using a 50 watt guitar amp. He's not using Les Paul Jr. anymore. He's using a new guitar his mate Paul Hammond has created. Now, the Hammond guitars don't really exist anymore, but they're a big deal in the 70s.
Huh.
And it sounds the same to me. But I think it's because that's the sound of the Hornby Skews treble booster. It tightens up the bass, so the lead lines are like, you know, they really have that soaring quality. And the guitar chords are very crunchy. But because you've got that tightened up bass, when you have the flute and the lead guitar line together, they don't fight, and they really kind of complement each other, and they can play note for note the same riff. So that, I think, is a signature move for Tull in this era anyway. And then right in the middle of the track, you hear the kick drum sounds kind of synthetic. You know, it's like a drum machine. And the synth comes in, there's a synth line that comes in there, and it's almost like a disco vibe. You know, like a Donna Summer.
So it begins,
I don't know if it's they are using the similar equipment. And then it just drops that, and it hits the most medieval riff I've ever heard in my life. How do you do that? You've got the signature move, you've got the disco, and then the medieval in one song.
That's the fun of it.
What a journey.
Yep. No, and I guess that's what we were hitting on with the changing moods and flavors every 15 seconds, which is a Jethro Tull staple. And we're going to come back around to that at the end, because I have deep thoughts about how much musical information they pack.
That's a 4-minute 30 song.
And as I said, should have been stupid with its simplicity, and yet was rich and abundant, like a cup of wonder. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to my guests, Nick, Omen, and Ed, for part 1 of Songs from the Woods, and we'll be back next time with part 2 of Songs from the Woods.
Bye.
Bye.